The central premise of this talk and this work is that you insure for next year, not an average year. And so you ought to have the best intelligence you can about what next year's seismic hazard is going to look like in an area that you're covering. And there's a way to do this because earthquakes are in a conversation. You know that they talk with each other. And that conversation is promoted by stress transfer. And so if we can build that into our forecast, we can give you a much better sense of what's coming. And think about it for a minute. The hazard models you're using were developed for the building code industry. For a building, what you care about is its survivability over about 50 years. But that is not what you're doing. You actually need to know how next year or the next decade is going to differ from the average, and that will allow you to better manage your exposures and have a better understanding of what could come next. So now with that, let me share the slides. Okay. Now, to give you an understanding of how earthquakes interact, I want to just put up a simple map of a strike-slip fault. Imagine this is a magnitude 7 earthquake. It's a right lateral fault, whichever side you're on. The other side is shoved to the right. What does that do to the shear stress? Well, you have these kind of blowtorch zones beyond the tips of the faults where the stress is increased, and it's mildly increased out here and out here. In the rest of the area, the shear stress has dropped. Now, shear stress promotes failure on faults, but it's not the only thing that promotes failure. Unclamping faults also promotes failure. And if we put that into the mix, you can see that because we've pulled material away from here, we've unclamped the fault. We've shoved material over here, we've clamped the fault. And so if we multiply this panel times the friction, roughly 3/4, and add them together, we get the Coulomb criteria. And what that tells us is, for this strike-slip rupture, it will promote earthquakes and aftershocks out here, and to a lesser extent here and here, and it will inhibit earthquakes in what we call the stress shadow zones. So that's the concept. You are shearing and unclamping to promote failure, and the reverse inhibits failure. Now, let's go out into the field and see how this plays out in the real world. So here is the site of the 1992 Landers earthquake, the earthquake that broke open this understanding of how earthquakes converse. You can see the fault isn't nice and clean. It's kind of grungy and it's arcuate. And as a result, this lobe is bigger and this lobe is smaller. This lobe is kind of what you saw in the previous figure. This one had another little earthquake before, so it's a little lumpy. And you also see the first 3 hours of aftershocks, the little white dots. And for the most part, they're along the fault or in these red zones. Here's what I want to point out. A magnitude 6.5 earthquake occurred just over 3 hours later in this red zone. Now, this calculation was made long after that magnitude 6.5, so it's not a blind forecast. And you could further say, well, wait a minute, couldn't I just throw a dart on this map and I have a pretty good shot of hitting a red or yellow zone? Maybe, but we have 10,000 aftershocks. And they tell us the same story. The aftershocks, by and large, cluster in the red and yellow zones, and their rates are actually lower in the stress shadows, the blue zones, than they were before the Landers earthquake. And further, 7 years later, we had a magnitude 7.1 in the other off-fault lobe. So these things matter. And by the way, the Ridgecrest 2009 earthquake occurred in this distant part of the yellow lobe too. Now, this concept has now been around for 25 years, and it's resulted in 30,000 research papers that have explored this and showed its applicability. But unbelievably, it's not in CAT models, and that's what's missing. So now I want to focus on a few cases where you can see these calculations that are done in advance of that second earthquake. So it is a blind forecast. And the first is one that was promoted by our team member, Shinji Toda, also at Tohoku University. And after this magnitude 6 in Kumamoto, Japan, southern island of Kyushu, you're now familiar with this pattern. He said, look, the Futogawa fault is in a stress trigger zone, and so is the Hinagu fault. And so one or more of those could rupture. This 6 could end up being a foreshock. So this was presented to the Japanese press. They published it the next day on the 15th, and 28 hours after that first earthquake, we had the magnitude 7 in which both of those faults ruptured. And you can even see that its aftershocks are consistent with this now larger pattern of stress triggered by this magnitude 7. So this is quite an accomplishment. This is a very short fuse in terms of timing, but very important for understanding what could happen next. Now let me take you to another part of the world on the Turkey-Greek border, where last October, a magnitude 7 earthquake occurred. Now, as you may remember, most of the damage was in the fourth largest city of Turkey, in Izmir. We sent an advisory to the Turkish authorities 30 hours after that earthquake, saying that because the stress trigger zone is here, this kind of bow tie pattern, and that Izmir lies in a stress shadow, Izmir would not be the site of large aftershocks. This turned out to be true. There were no large aftershocks in Izmir from the time this alert was submitted until today. And as a result, the claims activity in Izmir was less than was expected. So now this is a slightly longer time frame, but you can see its applicability to, for example, insurance moratorium, sales moratoria. You know, the one time that people really want to buy insurance is often when the insurance companies don't want to sell it. So you need to know, are our buyers in a stress shadow or a stress trigger? That will help you be able to maximize the ability to deliver on this demand. Now let's go back to the Landers earthquake and say, now what we need to do is build in time dependence, because aftershocks decay and we need to understand that. So what we do is we borrow from the theory of rate and state friction, developed by the great Jim Dietrich, formerly at the USGS and now at UC Riverside. And so now the red zones, as before, are areas where we expect a high rate of earthquakes, and the white zones are where we expect a low rate, because we're forecasting rates of earthquakes, not increases or decreases. And you can see this 3-year forecast does extremely well with the observed aftershocks, which are blue. So now let's go to China, to the site of the terrible 2008 magnitude 7.9 Wenchuan earthquake. Now that earthquake obviously is capable of producing large aftershocks. One occurred several years ago that sadly destroyed this national park. And I want to show you the forecast that we published in 2008. This is a 10-year forecast for magnitude 6 and larger earthquakes. And this is our hazard before the main shock occurred, before this big 2008 earthquake occurred. And now here is our modified hazard as a result of the stress transfer from this big event. And you can see, for example, these areas are redder than they are here. They have a higher hazard, as does this. But you can also see this white area, which was formerly yellow. That's a stress shadow. Same over here. This white area was formerly yellow-white, and that's a stress shadow. So what happened after publication? These two earthquakes occurred in the red zones. And my longtime scientific nemesis and detractor, David Jackson, who I finally realized late in life was right most of the time, and who is now my collaborator, has always said, only prospective testing counts. That's what you need, because you can't cook the books if it's already published. Now, another one of my most beloved mentors and advisor was the great Bob Wallace, the father of paleoseismology, the study of ancient earthquakes. And he gently remonstrated me by saying, look, Ross, you know, faults aren't simple planar cuts into a block of rubber. That's not what the earth looks like. It looks like this. And there's all kinds of different rock types. Faults come in all sizes. They're messy, they're grungy, and then you've got water squirting around. Well, that's a lot for me to tackle. But in one respect, what we have tried to do with real-time risk, what I'm describing to you, is to build in that messiness of actual faults as opposed to simple planar faults that you see here. How do we do that? Through beach balls. Beach balls are just a colloquial term for focal mechanisms, and it's really how a seismologist sees a fault. So these beach balls tell us the orientation and sense of slip on faults that have moved in past earthquakes. And what I'm doing in this calculation is using the magnitude 7.8 Kaikoura earthquake and calculating the stress on all those surrounding faults. And you can see, for example, it's increased stress here and decreased stress here. Now what I'm going to do on the right panel is compare that to the change in seismicity rate, where we saw more earthquakes after Kaikoura than before, aftershocks, you'll see it turn red. And where we saw a reduction in rate of earthquakes, you'll see it turn blue. And so notice that this red zone is perfectly coinciding with this red zone. This blue zone, where the rate of earthquakes reduced by a factor of about 10, coincides with this blue, this red here, and the red here, blue here, etc. They're very well correlated. And so this is the engine that drives a yet more accurate forecast and allows us to consider how an average year in New Zealand compares to next year when stress transfer from the 7.8 and the Canterbury earthquakes and several other large earthquakes that have occurred happen. And you can see they're quite different. Now, what are the uses of this? Well, once you understand that you're taking a higher or lower risk in one place than is the long-term average, you can prepare for that. Second event covers, short-term covers. You can shorten or lengthen a moratorium. And you can decide if you need more or less reinsurance. And what you know and the reinsurer doesn't know, or vice versa, matters in that negotiation. Okay, now I'd like to focus on two places of critical importance in the insurance market and also for stress interaction, Japan and Chile. So let's go to Japan. So here is Temblor's view of the long-term or the average hazard in Japan. It's quite different than the Japan national model, and because we expect a higher hazard along the Japan Trench and lower along the Nankai, which is the reverse of what most others find. But now we can compare this, our average year, to next year. Now, at first blush, what you notice is that next year is a lot glumpier and lumpier, and that's because we have concentrated areas of stress, like Kumamoto that we were talking about before. The principal reason it looks like this is because of the 2011 Tohoku earthquake, which basically shut down where the slip was highest and has produced this corona of high stress surrounding it, where we see some of the biggest glumps and lumps. Now, this is for the renewal year in Japan, which started April 1st and was given to our clients on January 26th. What's happened since? We've had 3 large earthquakes, 3 sevens in the region that it was forecast to have a much higher than average hazard. So this is a blind forecast and it's looking quite good. And as a result of these 3, we recalculated the hazard, and that's shown here. And as you can imagine, because of stress transfer on these 3, it's gotten even redder there. And we submitted just last week this to our clients, and then 12 hours later, we had a magnitude 6 here. So it continues to give us a refined and accurate picture of what could happen next. And finally, Chile. So here is our average behavior from the global earthquake activity rate model, as we showed you in Japan. And here is next year. So it's been highly influenced by the 2010 Maui magnitude 8.8 and the 8.5 Illapel and Iquique earthquakes farther north. So compare a place like Coquimbo. It's a lot redder next year than an average year. And now what we're able to do is create hazard curves. So here is the hazard curve for Coquimbo. The black and blue are an average year, and this is next year. So that's almost 2 orders of magnitude higher hazard. How about Santiago? Well, if you kind of look at 100, 200 kilometers around, you can see that it's redder than it is here. So it's higher. It's not as extremely higher as it was there. And you can see that Temuco is yellower on an average year than next year. And so Temuco has the opposite situation. So I want to acknowledge the tremendous lift of our CTO Volkan Sevilgan in transforming real-time risk into Temblor CAT hazard curves for next year and an average year. So let me close by saying, where have we done this? You've seen a number of the places. In addition, we've done it in Turkey, in the Philippines, and in Southern California. Where can we do it? We can do it everywhere. What time periods can we do it for? All periods. It can be as short as a moratorium period, as long as a cat bond maturation period, or a full decade look forward. But our argument is that this is a better representation of the risk that you take on when you have premium holders. Thank you.